Ladies and gentlemen, Don Spear.
Hi there, I'm Don Spear. I'm also called the Pondering Pundit from Prospect Farm in Freeman Township, Maine. People who know that I've been on a farm for the last 30-odd years are somewhat surprised when they learn that I'm an attorney. And so they'll ask me how come I chose that profession. And so I tell them about Robert Dunham Spear. He was my great grandfather, and he was born, bred, and died in Bowdenham, Maine. He lived and died in the 19th century. By 1870, he had become one of the most prominent lawyers in Maine. And that gives rise to the story I'm going to tell you tonight. And it's called The Saga of the Hanging of Eric Wright. Now, back then, Maine did still have the death penalty. It was growing out of favor, and so you couldn't have such a hanging. The hangings, by the way, were in the courtyard of the county where the crime had been committed. Well, you couldn't have a hanging unless the governor had a hearing to decide whether he approved it or whether he was going to commute it. Now, I have to cheat a minute. Robert, he married a local girl, and her name was Cordelia Purrington. She had a nickname, it was Dilla. Now that wasn't a contraction of her first name, because it was, in fact, that she was a Dilla. It wasn't but a few years into her marriage to Robert that she gained the reputation of being the best nagger in all of Bowdenham, if not the whole damn county of Saginaw. And poor Robert, he was most often the object of her affection. Now back then there was a man in town by the name of Eric Wright, and he was a hard-working man, and by the dint of his labor and devotion, he had been able to keep a roof over the family's head and food on the table. Now, this takes place when his children had grown up and flown the coop, and he came on early one Wednesday afternoon, and he came upon his wife and his best friend in flagrante delicto. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Latin or legalese, that means he caught him doing it. Well, he was so incensed by the sight that he took his rifle and he shot them both dead right on the spot. Otherwise, being an honorable man, why, he called up the sheriff and told him what he had done. He was promptly arrested and he was taken to the lockup in Bath. It so happened that the Superior Court was in session, and he was indicted on 2 counts of murder by the grand jury the very next day. On Friday, at his arraignment in the Superior Court, he pled not guilty despite the overwhelming evidence against him. You see, he figured that he'd get at least one man on that jury who had been cuckolded by his wife, and that man wasn't about to vote guilty, or at the very least, you wouldn't recommend the death penalty. Well, Eric didn't have any money, and so that meant the court had to appoint a lawyer for him, and given the serious nature of the crime, they appointed the best attorney in the county, and that happened to be my great-grandfather Robert. The trial took place the following Monday. It took 3 days for the case to go in, The judge instructed the jury on Thursday morning, and they took the case under deliberation. It only took them 2 hours to come back with a verdict of guilty, and they recommended the death penalty. Well, this, of course, was a sad occasion, but the judge wasted no time, because justice was swift back then, and he set the date of the hanging for the next Friday at 6 o'clock in the evening. He made a call to the governor's office, and the governor agreed to have the commutation hearing at 10 o'clock the morning of the hanging. Robert went back to Bodenham. He worked very hard for the rest of the day, and all day Friday, Saturday morning, he got up, had his breakfast, saddled up the horse, and rode to Augusta. It took all morning for both sides to get their pleas in, and then the governor recessed till 2 o'clock so everybody could have their dinner. And when they came back, Robert gave the most eloquent and emotional appeal of his life. And then when he finished, he saddled up his horse, rode out of the stable right into a blinding rainstorm. Now he rode all the way back to Bodenham, and he got there about 5 o'clock. When he did, he was soaked right through to the skin. He was exhausted from the week's activities and the harshness of the ride home. He was depressed because he hadn't been able to glean a single ray of hope out of the governor's face as he watched it throughout the hearing. He went in through the mudroom. He took off his hat, his boots, and his outer garments. And as he crossed the threshold into the kitchen, Dilly let him have it. "What do you mean by coming home at this hour on a Saturday evening? Don't you have any respect for me whatsoever? I waited all week to even get a word in with you, and now you've taken all of Saturday, half our weekend, and ruined it on this worthless case." And on she ranted and raved. But if Robert had learned one thing in his life, he learned never to utter a word in self-defense, because it would just increase the velocity of Dilly's attack, and it would last twice as long. And so he just went about his business in silence. His business was getting a glass, going to the ice chest, chipping off a couple chunks of ice, and topping the glass off with his best whiskey. And then he went into the room where the tub was kept, and he began to fix a hot bath. Dilly was right behind him, one half step of the way, yakking away like crazy. And when he started to take off his undergarments, she did back out over the threshold. And Robert took the opportunity to close the door. But that didn't stop Dilly 1 second. She kept right at him, right through the door. And she was going on for 10, 15 minutes, when about 5:45 the telephone rang, and she had to go answer it. By golly, it was the governor's office telling her that the governor had commuted the death penalty. Well, a very strange thing happened. She was struck with a feeling of remorse and regret. But even stranger, she decided to make amends. And so she fixed Robert another whiskey and went to take it to him. When she opened the door, she was greeted with an amazing vision. And there was Robert in his full nakedness, his full backside, lifting up 1 foot at a time and placing it on the edge of the tub and drying his legs and his feet off. And she decided to beat a hasty retreat. She set the whiskey down and she said, "They're not hanging Wright tonight." And Robert said, "Good Lord, woman, don't you ever stop?"